right, guys, I wanted to try something new. I had a quick conversation with somebody today about lease purchases. So I wanted to go through some pros, some cons, and kind of give you an overview about what is what even is a lease purchase. So a lease purchase is a tool that allows people that are not quite ready to purchase or for a variety of reasons to first lease the property and then ultimately at some point in the future buy the property or purchase the property. So if somebody enters into a lease purchase agreement, they're going to sign both a lease contract that's going to be just your typical lease agreement, and that's going to state, what is the rent, when is it due, what's the pet policy, who pays the utilities, how long of a lease is it for, these kind of things, what the security deposit is, um, and all the details, right? Then you would also sign a purchase and sale agreement. The purchase and sale agreement would say something to the effect of the buyer agrees to pay $300,000 for this home on or before, let's say, April 1st of 2021. So it's sometime in the future, right? So in order to enter into an agreement like this, a couple things need to take place. So number one is the owner should screen the prospect, right? Get a credit report, check references, check income, these types of things. Number one, to make sure that they're a good fit for a tenant. So want to make sure they make enough money to pay the rent, that they have a good history of paying rent in the past. That can oftentimes be get a better understanding for that based on their income, based on their credit references, based on their past landlords, and the type of money that they're making. So once you have established that this is a good candidate for rent, they also need to show you a pre-approval letter. So I'd like to see that the buyer gets an opportunity to sit down with a lender that can help them understand what type of, basically what's standing in the way of them buying now, right? Oftentimes people that want a lease purchase, they're generally doing it for one of two reasons. Either they're working on a credit issue, or perhaps they're like new to the area and they're waiting on some type of salary documentation or something like that prior to buying the property. Maybe it's part of a relocation or something of that nature, right? So you got a couple challenges here. Number one is you want to make sure that both the tenant is qualified to be a tenant and that the person is ultimately qualified to be a purchaser. In a normal straight lease without a purchase at all, you're generally looking at about 1 month's security deposit. So let's say the rent is $1,600 a month. The tenant would pay the first month's rent to move in, of course, would pay any pet fees or anything like that, obviously pay an application fee, and would also pay 1 month security deposit. If the renter has, let's say, not the greatest credit history, or maybe just came out of bankruptcy or some type of mark on their credit, the owner may decide to rent to that person under the understanding that they pay a second deposit, maybe 2 months rent as a security deposit rather than 1 month. Remember, everything is negotiable. There's no line in the sand or anything like that based on credit scores. It's completely negotiable. So a couple of things here. That is generally 1 to 2 months of deposit. In the case of somebody renting a, let's say, $1,600 a month place, that place may sell for, I don't know, $275,000, $300,000, something like that. So then the question is can they afford the mortgage? And a different question would be, can they afford the mortgage if the interest rate were to go up? So let's say the rate is 3.5 now. What if in a year it was 5? Could they still afford the property? So that's a challenge. Now, in order to go into a lease purchase, the seller is basically agreeing to sell the home in today's price at some point in the future. So what if they agree to sell the home for $275 and in let's say a year, a little over a year, the place is worth $300? So now the seller is taking substantially less for the home than they could or should. And in an effort, so why would a seller agree to do that? That's a good question. The seller would agree to do that because over 90% of lease purchases don't work. And there's a good likelihood that they could retain the security deposit when it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. Generally speaking, the security deposit is about 3 to 5%. So people think that they can get into a lease purchase for little to no money. That's actually not true at all. They're going to be putting up much more money than they normally would. So rather than 1 month's deposit, maybe 2 months deposit, they could be putting up anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 for the privilege of buying this home next year at today's price. Okay, so oftentimes what I recommend is for if you want to rent, rent. If you want to buy, buy. If you're not ready to buy, you probably shouldn't enter a lease purchase, particularly if you're working on credit issues, because what a lender will allow to fly next month or this week could be totally different in a year if credit standards have tightened or loosened or anything like that, right? Because we don't know what the rate is going to be next year. We don't even know for certain we could afford the property in a year. Also, what we're doing is we're betting that that's going to be the home we want to live in. Maybe the job is relocated to a different part of town. Maybe we don't like the job, right? Maybe we don't like the house, right? And if for whatever reason it is, you don't buy that home, you're going to lose all the deposits you've put down, which in most cases is pretty substantial, a lot more than you would risk if you were a renter. So the only way as a renter that you would be willing to do this, in my opinion, is if you were getting a screaming deal on the home. And the seller would, for that exact reason, would be reluctant to do so. Okay, so the buyer is basically making a pretty substantial bet. They're betting that, number one, that they can afford the home when that future closing date is going to be, based on interest rates, based on their income, based on their credit score, based on their ability to fund a down payment, etc. They're also betting that is in fact the best home, essentially in the universe, right? That fits their criteria at that time where they want to be. They can't find a better deal. That's why they're agreeing to buy this home now, or agreeing to buy it now, but sometime in the future they would officially close on it, right? They're also agreeing that the price will be right? So there's a lot of risk that the buyer is taking on in order for the privilege of entering into an agreement. What I've recommended in the past is for the buyer and seller to have some type of clause in the lease that might say something to the effect of seller will grant buyer, or tenant slash really tenant, I guess, would grant tenant a notice. Hey, my intention is to rent this home again at this price. I'm going to give you 7 days to agree if you want to stay or not. Or hey, the seller is going to sell this home for a list price of $300,000. You have 7 days to go under contract with me, or I'm going to open it up to the public. Something of that nature. So the seller gets to pick the price that's most appropriate for the market at that time, in the future. And the buyer gets to minimize the amount of risk that he puts out and financing or cash that he puts out, and can decide later on with somewhat of a first right of refusal if they want to renew the lease at whatever price it's going to be, or they want to buy the home at whatever price it's going to be. That's the way to secure essentially the fact that it wouldn't get rented out from under you or sold out from under you. Again, what's the incentive for a seller to offer something like that? It might be option money, right? You're going to buy the option to rent or buy this place in the future at an agreed upon price. If you're not willing to pay for the privilege of doing that, then the seller might not consider doing it. And that's completely understandable. So, long story short, the vast majority of lease purchases do not ultimately close, and they fall apart for a number of reasons. One is the value in the future is different than the value that was agreed upon, or the sales price that was agreed upon, and therefore the whole thing blows up. Or a stark change in the interest rates, which causes the home to be unaffordable. Or maybe the home wasn't what the tenant expected or wanted, or ultimately decided they wanted. And as a result, it just didn't fit their needs to purchase. And as a result, they ended up not purchasing, losing their security deposit / earnest money. And, oftentimes when you have an upset tenant, they may not respect your home as much as you would like them to. So lease purchases, they are a product that certainly has worked in the past for some people. The vast majority of the time it does not work. The way to protect yourself in a lease purchase is to advise your client both on a list of all the reasons why they should do it and all the reasons why they shouldn't do it, right? All the pros and all the cons based on who you're working with. Make sure a lender is involved to run the credit and to see whether this person has the potential to buy the home in the future. And I would make sure, of course, that everything is in writing. And then remember, our job is not to make the decision for our people. Our job is to share the pluses, share the minuses, and be a consultant, and be the economist of choice for your buyers and for your sellers, and ultimately let them make the decision. So thank you for throwing out the topic. If there's any other topics like this you'd like me to cover in the future, of course, just let me know.